Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a Tuesday tag. I don't do many tags, but this is more of a discussion tag type video really. This is the Edge of Reading tag, and I was tagged over by Brian over at Bookish, but it was originated by a new booktuber to me called Grix etc, and I shall post a link to both of those fine gentlemen's original versions of this. So this is just sort of delving into one's ideas around reading, what reading actually is, what it constitutes and stuff, which is an enormous subject, and there have been lots of books written about them, such as Marianne Wolf's Proust and the Squid, this Reading the Brain by Stanislas Dehaene, which I haven't read. It's a subject I'm interested in both as a reader and a writer, and initially I was a bit trepidatious about doing this because it's almost impossible to narrow down one's responses to it, but I'll give it a go. So the first prompt is, give your own definition of reading or use mine, i.e. Grix's, which is, reading is the act of interpretation of symbols that systematically put together in a certain sequence allow the reader to extract meaning from them in an active form of creation that can develop into complex narratives. Now I broadly agree with that, but I think there are several steps that presumes. Such as the mechanical act of reading is something that we are taught at school, or possibly before, and that one masters, and it is that sort of learning the code that is the alphabet in the Western system, and that those letters approximate the sound of words rather than the meaning of words, but we derive meaning because we have those meanings defined in a dictionary, and indeed we accrete letters into words, words into sentences, sentences into narratives. It's worth making a distinction between books that we read for information and books that we read for pleasure or entertainment. Obviously pleasure and entertaining books can also include information, but there's a whole tranche of reading which is purely about gleaning information, and I'm not really going to talk about those because, I mean, who reads those for pleasure? And the aforementioned Marianne Wolf described reading as that miraculous act between two people, miraculous act of communication between two people when one of them is absent, which I think is nice, but also it would make the telephone to be a miraculous act, which it isn't. And indeed, telephone use has sort of gradually decreased for visual communication in the form of texts and things like that. So but the heart of that is this notion that the author is absent other than the words they leave behind on the printed page, and that there is an imaginative act whereby the reader decodes those words and derives hopefully pleasure and entertainment, but also potentially meaning. But there's a whole issue about deriving meaning from works of fiction, which again are pretty much what I'm going to restrict myself to in this discussion. Barthes would say that the author is irrelevant in this process, that because the reader is creating a new meaning for the words that the author has put down on the page. Now, are they creating meaning or are they recreating meaning? And obviously there's lots of different ways to interpret an author's work. So in that sense, each reader does create it for themselves, create it anew from the other readers. But you can see you get into a whole sort of quagmire of things here. So I sort of agree, but I also don't agree, because we can't take this mechanical act of scanning symbols for granted. You know, it has to be inculcated through learning to read. But then once we have the tools, the mechanical act of scanning print and understanding words, but then our subjective interpretation kicks in as to what we derive from those. Also, narratives don't have to be complex, which is another point that Grix ended his thing with. You can have perfectly simple narratives, but they have other values. Okay, given your chosen definition, are reading and interpretation the same thing? If not, how do they differ? Reading and interpretation, yes. I think they are different things, because reading is a mechanical act that anyone who's been taught to read, anyone who's literate, can do. Whereas each one of those people reading the same text will interpret it in a different way. So I think they are fundamentally different. Are there any practices that you consider reading, but they would not fit that or other definitions of reading? Yeah, reading runes. Maybe, do you read runes? Do you read pictograms in the same way as we've just defined reading as, well, runes and pictograms are symbols just as much as alphabets are. And obviously alphabets have assumed sort of pictographic languages in many places, so, but not all, obviously. And interestingly, that the origins of a lot of alphabets still retain that link to the pictographic origins, in that from the sort of the Hebrew and the Phoenicians that eventually went into being Greek and Latin alphabets. So, for example, in the Hebrew language, the second letter bet, which is the sound we have B, is visually like a house, because a bet is a house in Hebrew. So there are still faint echoes of the pictographic origins of languages. Clouds. Some people read clouds, some people read animal entrails. You know, we can possibly say that it's not a strictly abiding by the what we mean by reading, but conversationally and vernacularly we say reading entrails, or you know, things like that. We also say that we read other people's body language. So I suppose all of these things are stressing the visual element of reading. Of course, now you can read through an audiobook where there isn't really a visual element of it. Is there any ideal reading experience for you? What is it? Is there a book that represents it? I think for me, as a writer, first and foremost, I think novels can only teach us about novels. They can tell us a story, but if you're relying on that story to inform you about how the real world operates, I think you're on a losing battle there. So when I say novels only really tell us about novels, what I like, my perfect ideal reading experience, is a novel that deconstructs itself as it goes along. It sort of shows you its workings, but you know, not in a tedious way, not in this is how a writer sits down and writes, but in a way that sort of has refractions and reverberations. That in the text of that novel, it's setting off all sorts of associations and questions about how that novel comes about, why it takes that structure, what that structure does to enhance levels of meaning. So for me, an ideal example of this would be David Markson. This is not a novel. He postulates in the title that what you're about to read is not a novel, and yet it is unutterably a novel. And it is unutterably a novel made up of non-fiction, pretty much. There's probably about 3 to 5% of the text is insertions by Markson that are fictional, belong to a fictional character, the character of a writer. But most of the stuff is made up of stuff that real historical characters, politicians, sportsmen, war leaders, artists, poets, etc., etc., that they have written or said and has been recorded. And it's the skillful arrangement of these that gives this novel a narrative flow. It does move forward, it does advance, even though it doesn't have any characters, it doesn't have any plot, doesn't have any descriptions of scenery, doesn't have any dialogue, although in a way it's all dialogue, or one half of a dialogue from each person, so quoted. And it just makes the reader question all these things we take for granted about what a novel is. A novel is fiction. Well, this book is fiction, but made up of non-fiction. And, you know, it has no characters, it has no plot, as I say, and yet it is unutterably a novel. So I like novels that do that. Ben Marcus's The Age of Wire and String does a similar deconstruction job for language, which obviously is the key component of any novel. I mean, I've always felt that language is the only thing we have on an author's easel. There is nothing else. And that everything like plot and character and scenery, description and imagery and metaphor, these are all scaffolding poles, or keeping the arts imagery. They are the easel on which the canvas is stretched. But it is the application of the words to the page, which become a printed page. That is all an author can control. And it is the artifice of that, which goes back to my sort of long-winded definition to the first prompt, that induces meaning. And when I say Ben Marcus's book does for language what Rothko does for the other parts of the novel, he is questioning how language works, because you have all these basically the premise is that we humans are being observed as if by an alien intelligence. They have access to all our dictionaries, so they know all the words or the vocabulary, but obviously they haven't developed that organically. They haven't grown up as children mastering language, applying words to actions or words to objects. So they're viewing things like a child on a swing, for example, and because they don't know what that is, they're sort of forming all these word constructions which make perfect syntactical sense as a sentence, but they don't apply to the action of observing someone on a swing. And out of this develops a sort of curious poetry, and it's just wonderful. And I'm going to come back to this notion of bringing words together as sort of lyrical poetry in another answer to one of my prompts. So those are two books that just give me absolute sort of perfection in terms of this prompt, which is my ideal reading experience. I will say also that I have the attitude that and this, I write these types of books, and I can't help feeling, when I said, the novel can only sort of teach us about the novel, I don't believe that novels can help us learn about the world around us, because novels are fiction. However, I would offer philosophically that the world around us is a fiction, in the sense that it is a construction, a consensus of what we agree if we look out the window. There's a car, there's a house, there's the sky. All these linguistic terms apply to material objects, but we agree that's what they are. Because if man was wiped out tomorrow, yes, the sky would still be there, but it wouldn't be called in a reflective way and a knowing way a sky, because there'd be no one to apply it. Animals don't call it the sky. They may use it to navigate by. They may use it to tell the difference between night and day, but they don't have a concept of it, or certainly not a linguistic concept of it. So I feel that everyday reality is a construct. And where novels can help us is in appreciating and understanding and keep reminding us that the everyday reality outside our window, though it functions and we can live lives within that, is still a construct, is still a fiction, and that we might get better at spotting the fictive elements of this. So that's another element that I believe reading can give us, rather than a sort of treatment of realism. You can describe someone taking a walk and what they see and stuff, and superficially that is realism, but actually to me it obfuscates the fact that there are a lot of built-in assumptions and presumptions about the reality that they are describing. If there is such a thing as an ideal reading experience, it follows that there is a scale of value to reading. What is at the bottom? Well, for me in fiction, it's books that only tell a story, and this isn't necessarily genre books, although they are more guilty of that. I need more than just storytelling. After all, there are 6, 7 basic stories in the world. We would get very bored if we were only invested in story. Now obviously what brings variety to story is the investment in different characters, different themes, all this stuff makes these basic 6 plots much more rich. And I say it doesn't necessarily apply only to genre work, because I just read a book by Linda Grant called The Story of the Forest. I think she'd probably be called a literary author. She appears in the past and nominated for various book prizes, literary book prizes. But to me, ultimately, the book told a story and did nothing else, and therefore to me was not interesting, was disappointing. So I need more than just a story. Jung has a concept of the collective unconsciousness. And why are there only 7 stories? Why do these archetypical characters keep turning up in story after story after story across different cultures throughout the world? And I think it's probably true that they do. But to me, that is not proof of a collective unconsciousness, as Jung posits. To me, that's proof of the limitations of human perception and senses, that we are funneled into producing this narrow band, narrow range of these archetypical characters and archetypical stories. And that even though there are big global variances between, say, the Mesoamerican mythos that the world is basically a turtle shell, or Popol Vuh, which is involves this sort of this alligator stuff. But to me, they're applying local specifics of what's in their environment, and then they're sort of making them into these myths which have resonance with things on the other side of the world, which will use different localized objects. So I actually think it doesn't speak to a collective unconsciousness, except in the way of the narrowness of our senses that channel and restrict what our imaginations are able to come up with. So I don't find it terribly useful. Is reading, as the art of associating symbols and creating meaning out of them, a predecessor of language, or does it come after as a consequence of those languages? Well, I've already said that reading is a trained act. It's an acquired skill, whereby we have to, on a physical level, sort of have our eyes scanning a text, and then we feed in with the acquired skill of recognising the symbols of language. Our acquisition of language predates that by some way. You don't start learning to read and write till 3 or 4 years old at the earliest, whereas you start acquiring language from probably, I don't know, a year, 18 months through mimicking sound. And of course you have this sort of dissociation of a written language, which itself is there to code you into the sound of words, but not the meaning of words. There's no association between the alphabetic representation of words and their meaning. We know that meaning because we've learnt what words mean long before we've seen them written down. So no, absolutely, language precedes reading by a long way. Just going back to story, so I'm very inimical to story. I think stories cut us off from true creativity, because stories pre-exist, and yes, we may fine-tune them and tweak them and make them our own, but stories now permeate everything. Do you remember Storyfy on social media? Well, everything now is a story. It has to be a story. Even a charity ask for donations has to take the form of a story of the victim that your charity is going to help. The news is a story, always has been. Everything is becomes storyfied, and I think that's a problem, because those narratives aren't necessarily representative of what's actually going on. And if you want an example of the ubiquity of story, the ancients, they looked up into the night sky and they saw these twinkling lights, as we ourselves still do, obviously. And what did they do? They started drawing lines which do not exist anywhere in nature, or straight lines, and they sort of gave them these sort of mythological beings like Orion and whoever else, and started making up stories about them. I mean, what an insane mechanism. We don't understand, the ancients didn't understand what stars were, blah 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 blah, so they invent this whole mythos around them. Why do we have that tendency? I mean, I appreciate that the ancients couldn't afford to hang around for 2,000 years for the invention of, you know, electronic telescopes and things like that. I get it, you know. You don't understand what it is, you want to put some meaning on it, but it's such a random thing to do. So this storytelling drive is it innate? I don't know if it's innate. The need for pattern, you know, stories and narratives help sort of us put patterns on what would otherwise be chaotic. And I think in a way, if life is chaotic, which I suspect it probably is, it would be more useful to us to have ways of expressing and analysing that and understanding and accepting its chaoticness, rather than sort of imposing these artificial pattern-making things called stories and narratives. Is everything that can be read with meaning a language? Is everything that can be read with a meaning language? Yes. It may not be an alphabetic-based language, but yes, it is, I believe. Mention a few languages that defy the conventional conception of what a language is. Could a book be written in any of those languages? Okay, well, I've got several examples for this. So I have a writer friend called Dan Holloway, who wrote a wonderful little book called Evie and Guy. I don't know if it's still available, in which, after a one-page introduction, all the rest of the text was numbers. So, you know, not an alphabetic language-based book at all, apart from the intro. And what you realise is that these numbers are a masturbation diary for the male character in a relationship, Guy, and that by tracing the course of his masturbation diary, you can plot the ups and downs of their relationship. Obviously, when they're happy and they're in love and having sex, he's not masturbating. So, you know, it's a bit of a one-trick pony, but I think it's wonderful, and it you know, it has a narrative drive in the same way as Marxism does, but it doesn't even use human language. It uses human mathematical language, but not what we would recognise as a prose language. The next thing is the ancient Hebrew language is a gematria, by which all the letters, I can't remember how many there are in the Hebrew alphabet, is it 20? I think maybe 20 letters. They each have not only obviously, as our alphabet has A, B, C, or as I say, B in our language is Bet in Hebrew, but they also have a numerical value. And one of the applications of this is that for religious people studying the religious texts of the Talmud and the Torah, you have three levels of interpretation. One is it's the word of God, therefore it's true. This is literally the Holy Writ. The second is use your own powers of reason and logic and read the scholars who have commented and done exegesis on these texts to get more knowledge, more understanding, more questioning, but also more, you know, interpretation of the text. And that if you do that to the nth degree, you will find the proofs, because it will be in logic, it will be irrefutable in the same way as mathematical proofs are irrefutable. But then you have this third, this gematria, that if you add up the numerical values that are in words of the holy text of the Torah, that will also prove like an equation balances, like an equation, some A plus B equals C. You'll be able to do that with the text of the Torah by applying the numerical values of it. So again, in a bit like Evie and Guy, this sort of numerical, which, you know, has a different resonance to a written language, which is much more, there's much more room in language for elision and ellipsis and ambiguity, whereas with maths, whether you accept this or not, a whole different debate, you know, it either adds up and balances or it doesn't. So both sort of Dan's book and the gematria are sort of numerical versions of this. But I also want to talk about kennings, which are beautiful, particularly in the sort of the Icelandic sagas, but as passed down in a much more restricted form. And what they are, it's like two poetic expressions joined into one word. So the word boat in a kenning would be a wave traveller, which is much more lyrical and poetic, much more metaphorical. And German, modern day German, has a version of this whereby they compound words together. It's not limited to just two words like wave and traveller. In German, there's no limit on how many different words you can jam together. So where the word that you're after doesn't exist, if you bring together the component elements of what you're trying to express, you can put them in one word. And I love that about German, and I wish English did that. So I would love to read, or I'd love a modern day version that was reverted to the kenning, as I say, this sort of dual elements making up a metaphor, but in such a lyrical, poetic way. But failing that, you've got the concept of compound words in German. If you could boundlessly read or understand the meaning in one of those languages, which one would it be? Oh, as I said, yeah, I mean, I'd like to be able to write in German, but I'd also like to employ kennings. I don't think I could go down the mathematical or the geometry route. That I find less exciting because they're getting away from language so much, as I say, from the sort of flabbiness of language, which is where the interest for me lies. That has less interest for me to explore mathematical versions of it. But I'm all about the metaphor and the poetry and the lyricism of words and how words decay, how they change, how they can flip from being one type of meaning to another, how you have contronyms, so the word cleave, you can cleave together or cleave apart. The word fast, you can hold fast or you can run away fast. So they're sort of contradictory meanings within the same word. And I love the sort of exploration of those. So there you have it. Thanks very much to Brian and to Grix, etc. I throw this open to anyone who wants to talk about how they understand the reading process, what it means to them. Till next time, thanks very much.